We want to begin the next presentation, and it is my honor to invite my friend and colleague, Susan Kaiser, to the stage to introduce the next speaker. Susan is Professor Emerita of Women and Gender Studies, but she also was our wonderful dean for several years in the College of Letters and Sciences for the Humanities and the Arts and Cultural Studies, and, you know, one of the most lovely people I've ever met. So, Susan, come on up.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that really generous introduction. And also, I just want to say it's been so exciting to see GTI develop over the years. I'm so impressed and excited. And today I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor Stephanie Y. Evans. And Stephanie is Professor of Black Women's Studies and has served as the director of the Institute for Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. She's also affiliated with the Department of African American Studies and the Center for the Study of Stress, Trauma, and Resilience. She's a very prolific author. I just enjoyed reading her work so much and learning more about her. She studies Black women's intellectual history, mental health and wellness, social justice, empowerment, education, and has a particular focus in her methodology on African American autobiography and memoirs, particularly themes ranging from yoga to mental health, to travel, to social justice. And we're really fortunate, lucky for us, she's been shifting her attention to tea as of late. But before that, she has numerous publications, 3 single-authored books. Black Women's Yoga History is the most recent, Memoirs of Inner Peace at SUNY, from SUNY Press, Black Passports, Travel Memoirs as a Tool for Youth Empowerment, and Black Women in the Ivory Tower, 1850 to 1954. Today, she's going to address her work on memoirs with African women, Black women, to map a history of traditions from herbal senna and sassafras to Pico in Kenya and Virginia. And as you'll see, I'm very sure, shortly, she demonstrates how historical narratives offer lessons for creating internal and external green space, as she describes it. So I'm very, very happy to introduce Dr. Evans.
Okay, good morning, afternoon. Where am I? What state is this? Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. Again, my name is Stephanie Evans, and I am coming from Georgia State University. It is a blessing, an honor to be here. I'm grateful so much to GTI and Catherine, just amazing work. This is a beautifully orchestrated event. As someone who served as department chair for 12 consecutive years at 3 different institutions, I understand that it is a true team effort to put something on like this that is global, and there's a lot of moving parts. So I do not take for granted the work that it took to bring this back into person after the pandemic. I'm absolutely grateful. I'm truly humbled and honored to be here to share what is the preliminary efforts of my work. I'm just dipping my big toe into the tea pool. And so I'm just here to share the work that I've done so far. Today, I'll be presenting Black Tea History, Roots of Wellness in the African Diaspora. And I am a very visual learner, and so I commissioned an art piece to kind of represent what I see as a multi-generational historical gathering of African and African American women African women from the diaspora in all different types of tastes and flavors and colors and experiences and historical eras, gathering at initially what was going to be a wine garden. But as I began to explore the overlap between wine culture and tea culture, can also be a tea garden. So I'll get into the details of this a little bit later. So I'm talking today about African feminist values, practicing and teaching traditions. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who was a founding member of the Association of Black Women Historians, wrote about Black women's values. Perhaps the two most dominant values in African feminist theory, which can be traced through a time perspective into the New World, are developing survival strategies, which I'm calling self-care, and encouraging self-reliance through female networks, or collective care. And my work addresses self-care, and we were talking earlier about marketing and how the image of self-care, and particularly things like yoga, is presented as something that is new, as something that is hot, as something that only a certain particular population takes advantage of. My work in uncovering people like Rosa Parks, who was an avid yoga practitioner. And I've seen, if you just search Rosa Parks yoga, and you'll see Mrs. Parks, the mother of the civil rights movement, it was an advanced yogi. And so I'm trying to uncover the history of African American women in representation in spaces that we desperately need now, because we need to understand self-care, especially in higher education. Self-care is imperative. Collective care is imperative. These two things are not diametrically opposed. Right? You can take care of yourself and take care of your community. And so I'm putting these things in conversation with the idea of Black women's articulation of values. My work is Black women's intellectual history. I'm a geek. I've always been a geek. I'm an Air Force brat, so I was born in Washington, D.C., and I moved to California, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Germany for 3 years between the ages of 7 and 10, which had a great impact on my work. And then Arizona, New Mexico, a couple of Illinois, a couple of other places, all before I was a teenager. So books were my best friends. And so my work is really inquiring about the history of Black women's ideas. I'm a first-generation college student. My undergrad was actually at California State University, Long Beach, so it's great to be back in California. But I encountered this absence, this void of the representation of Black women, not just in history, but as in intellectual history. So the first book was a query into how African American women educators, like Fannie Jackson Coppin, Mary McLeod Bethune, and those type of women thought about what higher education should be. Black Passports, as was mentioned earlier, really was a take on the skills that I developed in the transferable skills that I developed in seeing myself as a global citizen early on, and how we can look to history, historical narratives, and memoirs, travel memoirs in particular, as ways to empower youth. The most recent book, Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Inner Peace, was a query into, I amassed, as I'll show in a minute, an archive, a library of Black women's life writing. There was not an existing archive that held all of the narratives that I wanted to use, at least as a primary sources, as a scope for my research. So I developed that, and that was the basis of Black women's yoga history. You'll see that there is an African American woman or African woman with what's presumed to be a Bible. This is the artwork of Annie Lee. And you'll see right there nestled is a nice cup of tea. A lot of people are very familiar with Annie Lee's work, Blue Monday. And these are the two representations of an African American woman, and she's stressed out. It was a self-portrait when she was working for the Chicago Railroad and had to get up at 5:30 in the morning, and juxtaposed with this view here. And then I began, after I completed the yoga book, I realized I drink a lot of wine, and I would love to get to know more about the history of Black women in wine. And again, that's how I got to this question of how African women in the diaspora write about things like yoga and wine and tea, as an act of understanding how we can better care for ourselves and our communities. This work is part of a collective, and I do focus on mental health, moving from intellectual history to mental health, questions about the life of the mind. Many Black women have a history of practices and traditions that assisted in their mental health maintenance. One way to connect with oneself is to start again with these traditions that brought about joy in one's life previously. Another important step is to teach these traditions to other Black women, and especially to girls. So I'm working, and this is a picture of myself and my colleagues who are mental health professionals, and we're exploring how Black women's ideas and traditions and practices can be passed on. Because theoretically, I view memoirs as what Maya Angelou calls letters to our daughters. So we're writing our life narratives, we're writing these epistles to the next generation of how to live well. This is the Africana Memoirs database. I just began obsessing and collecting narratives from all over the world. And so my question then became, what have Black women elders written about wellness and in these areas? I found over 50 references to yoga, over 150 references to meditation, over 250 references to wine, and by far the most popular reference of wellness practice in Black women's memoirs, tea, over 320 references to tea so far. So I'm viewing tea as what Toni Tipton Martin calls a memory dish. In her work, and she looks at historical cookbooks as her primary sources, I looked for aspects of African cooking in Old South menus and in Black cookbooks, the Africanisms, ingredients, techniques, and folkways that survived the Middle Passage. Water with honey, fermented palm and fruit wines, corn and ginger beer, tea brewed from kola nuts and hibiscus flowers, and drinks of sour milk thickened with millet. So I'm situating my work within a continuing idea of Black and African traditions, foodways in particular. One of the earliest references to tea I found was in Harriet Jacobs' work, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861. Harriet Jacobs was born in North Carolina, enslaved. She escaped, and because she was being pursued by her so-called owner. She escaped to hide for 7 years in the attic of her grandmother. And she says in what's a chapter called A Loophole of Retreat, my condition was now a little improved because she was hiding in a crawl space in the attic, and her grandmother cared for her. But for weeks I was tormented by hundreds of little red insects, fine as a needlepoint, that pierced through my skin and produced an intolerable burning. My good grandmother gave me herb teas and cooling medicines, and finally I got rid of them. The heat of my den was intense, for nothing but thin shingles protected me from the scorching summer sun. So I'm recognizing, as I did with yoga, that tea has a particular African tradition. So I started college at St. John's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the home of the great books. So we read Homer and Aeschylus and Plato, and we read Thucydides, the history, and Herodotus, the Peloponnesian War. And I was infatuated by Africans that were mentioned in that. But it was presented that Greeks were the beginning of the civilization, and everything before that was prehistory. So I'm very invested in the idea that Africans have a unique history that is worthy of study as much as any other culture, but is usually pushed aside or erased or sidelined or maligned. I am, however, also very invested in the notion that African Americans have a long history of honoring Asian cultures, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Thai, that we have a deep understanding and appreciation of the roots of what is known as classical tea, true tea, Camellia sinensis. So I'm understanding, even at this very beginning point of my study, the importance of separating tea and tisanes, right? And not just throwing everything together. But again, I'm at the very beginning, so grace is appreciated. But Anna Julia Cooper, who was also born enslaved in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1858, lived to be 105 and a half. She earned her PhD from the Sorbonne in Paris. She wrote her dissertation in French and defended in French. And she was part of a cadre of the first Black women graduates, the first Black graduates from Oberlin College. She went on to a teaching career in Washington, D.C. and taught for 70 years. And she was part of a thriving community at what now we know as Dunbar High School, very closely connected to Howard University as well. And she, in her early life in Washington, this is a reflection that she wrote in 1951 about her early life, about beginning in the 1880s in Washington, D.C. And this is just fantastic description. I think I owe any cultivation I have now to the taste for teas, to that acquired at Mrs. Grimske's hospitable board. Prior to my Cochrane Street training in the flavors of oolong, formosa, salada, and the various India and Chinese brews, I confess the only conscious requirement I demanded was that it should be wet and sweet. Mr. Grimke challenged all that, for he was a consummate miracle man who transformed water fresh from the spigot, brought quickly to the first bubble boil, into the brilliant amber-colored nectar that shed the delicate aroma of a tropical forest or bouquet of tuberoses. He had a 3-minute glass that came from Pisa, Italy. It took just so many minutes for the fine sands to flow from the upper to the lower bowl. Just so, not a second longer must the hot water remain on the tea leaves. And when the delighted oohs and ahs from his admiring audience announced that the performance was a complete success, Mrs. Grimke would say, "I assure you, Frank is quite proud of the fact that he tops all competitors in the fine art of brewing tea. We shall call him the champion brewer." And this was an important find for me because, again, it's an understanding that I'm speaking when I say Africa and the diaspora, particularly from African and African roots and Caribbean roots, but also from an appreciation of those who have come before, who took time to truly appreciate tea and tisanes. So far, I've begun to compile a global list. Africa tells us about tea in Kenya, for example. And I'm learning just about the regions of where Camellia sinensis thrives because of the environment. Again, like wine, it's very much required to have a certain terroir to thrive. Kenya is one of those places. And immediately, when we think about the narratives that African women offer, as was acknowledged earlier, that the labor of tea is largely women's labor. Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her Greenbelt movement, talked about the challenges that tea and coffee plantation offered her home of Kenya. And that where she grew up, which was just about an hour north of Nairobi, that the environment thrived because of the diversity of the plants and the flowers and the trees. But when tea plantations came in, that really had a negative effect on the soil, as well as some of the labor. And so that immediately complicated the narrative of tea and tea history for me. There's also Margot Okazawa Ray, who is a Japanese Afro-American, and as a women's studies activist, she is very heavily and deeply involved in women's work, women's organizing, and anti-militarism. She has an African-American father and a Japanese mother. And so her identity and her legacy, her understanding of the practices of tea as an organizing principle for women worldwide who are getting together, but also the militarization that comes with understanding the history of tea, the history of labor, the history of politics, war, economics, and how all of that impacts what she calls social location theory, right? Micro, meso, macro, global. Who we are as individuals, our communities, our role in our nation, and those international relationships as well. Mary C. Cole, who I'm sure many of you have heard about, was born in Jamaica and is buried in England. And she was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale. Her mother, who she called a doctress, taught her about herbs in Jamaica and teas and she opened what was a tea house in Crimea. So at a point when Russia was assaulting what is now Ukraine, sounds familiar, she actually wanted to join in the war effort and go as a nurse, but because of discrimination was not allowed to go. She, of course, went anyway and opened a tea house. And she catered to the officers. She was a distinguished businesswoman, but she also used tea and talked about different types of teas, the senna that she used in her tea and baking, the appetite, she says, that the soldiers had for tea, the cinnamon that she would put in tea for someone who was just about to expire as she held their hand. So she, traveled globally, but ended up being buried and honored in England. Rita Marley talks about hibiscus tea and sorrel, but she also, again, complicates the story when she talks about having a puff of herb, and we're talking about herb, right, and herb tea, and how if just when she wants to say the right thing at the right time, a sip or a puff will put her in the right state of mind to be able to know just what to say and when to say it. And so, and she has also a connection to Ethiopia. She opened a health food restaurant in Jamaica, and it was called Makeda, who was the Queen of Sheba, right? The Ethiopian connection between Jamaica and Ethiopia there is really interesting. But she talked about juicing and growing her own herbs and feeding from the land. So there's an agricultural history there as well, which is appropriate here in the land of the Aggies. And finally, people like Eartha Kitt, who I am exploring, had a very complex relationship to tea. She used chamomile tea and talked about her using chamomile tea for beauty. But she also used tea for very interesting political and intellectual connections. She mentions being invited or inviting Albert Einstein for tea in New Jersey, he accepting the invitation, and they have a lovely conversation, not about the theories of relativity, of course, but that the ability for tea to bring people together, to be an occasion, to have an interesting conversation. But she also was thrown out of the White House in 1968 for being invited to a polite ladies' tea, and then bringing up the war and why certain people were, particularly young African-American men, were being disproportionately impacted, and what was the White House going to do. And so she was summarily thrown out and blacklisted for the next 30 years. And so we see the political aspects of tea there as well. Right, 4 minutes. So I've so far, again, I'm obsessed with maps because as a young traveler, I like to kind of pinpoint my data. So this is what I found so far in terms of the locations. I have applied for a research leave for the fall so I can go begin to really dig into the preliminary findings. I've begun to map the tea. I've found in 42 different countries, each with very interesting individual stories, communal stories, traditions from those particular times. So all throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, and North America in particular. Finding some things in South Carolina that indicate there's really kind of one operating tea plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, that is still functioning, and that then helps me have the conversation and connect tea to African-American history and investigate tea as a plantation crop here in the United States. I've begun to map different types of varietals of hibiscus, rooibos in South Africa, senna that is in different parts of Africa, but also in the Caribbean, and try to get kind of mapping these overlaps, the mentions of chai tea, which is now pervasive, but kind of experienced by women like Jan Willis, who studied in Tibet, who studied in India, who studied in areas of China, and is a religious studies professor, so how she experienced tea in her meditation practice as well. And then, of course, ginger, jasmine, gypsumweed, and all sorts of number of things. I'm also very mindful of the responsibility to take tea seriously and complicate the history and not just kind of celebrate the history. There was a Civil War nurse who mentioned sassafras, and I got all excited, and then found out that sassafras has been, because I am working with tea professionals in Savannah and Atlanta who know about the tea industry, who know about the conditions, and we can learn that sassafras and saffroil have been banned since 1960 because the extract. So while we can honor the stories of those who say, I grew up drinking sassafras tea from sassafras root, particularly the Gullah people, I also have to be mindful of the ways that tea can be harmful and what's on the list for kind of clear use of tea like sinensis, peppermint, hibiscus, and chamomile. So I'm also doing these secondary source information to help me navigate the narration. Very much like the presenter before me, which was absolutely fantastic, I'm talking about physical, mental, and spiritual health, social, economic, and political health. And Angela Davis in 1987 gave a talk about Black women's health and what we're talking about when we say health. The pursuit of health in body, mind, and spirit weaves in and out of every major struggle women have ever waged in our quest for social, economic, and political emancipation. So I'm using this idea of defining holistic health specifically as a organizational methodology to pull apart the findings from these narratives. And I'll end with kind of a definition of some of the preliminary findings that Black women's intellectual history, Black women's life stories and memoirs tell us about tea in fascinating ways. Tea for anxiety, depression, relaxation, just to slow down. Which in academia, can we just slow down just for a minute, please? Is it possible, right, to slow down, just to have a cup of tea? You know why? Just because, right? Not to monetize it, not to have a publication about, but just actually to enjoy. These narratives help us understand tea in terms of reproductive health histories. There's some fascinating stories about African and African-American women managing their own reproductive health, whether that's period teas or passing certain teas down to, for fertility control, particularly when we were being serially raped. That was an important skill set to have. Teas for colds, soothing, symptoms of illness, voice and maintenance. Several opera singers talk about tea and honey and hot water and what warm water can do, like Jessie Norman talks about tea as part of her ritual. Marian Anderson as well, who actually visited Japan and has fabulous stories about that. I think you'd be interested. Spiritual tea, Buddhism, Christianity. Tea was a big church fundraiser. You could raise $10,000 on a good church tea, and then put that money towards social goods. Judaism and African indigenous in the Americas, but also in Australia, Aboriginal women talking about their history of tea. And social culinary traditions. Edna Lewis talks about using orange pekoe and mint as part of her signature recipe. This is a James Beard Award-winning Edna Lewis from Virginia, talking about her culinary skill with creating the perfect iced tea. Supper clubs, socializing children, tea parties, which we all know. And then the economic aspects of colonization and enslavement, plantation labor, but also business ownership. More recently, African-American women getting into their own tea shops as well. And then political narratives talk about temperance, the temperance movement. We're just going to get together to have a cup of tea and talk about women's voting. But anyway, it's just tea, right? We're just going to talk about tea while we try to get the vote. the Black Women's Club movement, several White House politics tea, Mary McLeod Bethune, Dorothy Height, Pauli Murray, Eartha Kitt, Lorraine Hansberry, Belva Davis, and Michelle Obama, who had a chamomile garden, and also honeybees in the White House, which were summarily destroyed. And lastly, the Me Too movement. And so I'll close by saying, what am I doing? Okay, perfect. I'll close by saying African-American women have a rich history of tea. African-Americans, Africans, obviously tea throughout Africa and different countries can be a male tradition. There's a rite of how Moroccan tea is poured. There's a rite of how these tea in Senegal, and there's very rich traditions of African men. Dr. Du Bois himself actually sold tea as one of his early jobs, right? And so there's a rich history there. I'm focusing on African American women as kind of a natural evolution of my interest in wanting to see Black women represented in mine. And so when you think about phrases like spill the tea, right, which comes from a Black trans woman, the Lady Chablis of Savannah, Georgia. And when you think about take no tea for the fever, which is that Black women don't take no mess, as articulated by Maya Angelou herself, we have something to contribute to this conversation. I'll close by saying thank you again so much. This has just been a thrill. I look forward to listening and learning and being in conversation with you all.
And so I'm sure there are questions in this audience, so please go to the microphones so that everybody can hear your questions, and also so it can be recorded for posterity. So don't be shy, step right up. Go ahead.
Hi, first as a fellow Washingtonian, hi to another transplanted Washingtonian. My question is, did you read or encounter much about attempts at developing a tea industry or tea market for African grown tea? I know there's some now, like purple teas, but I was just wondering if there's much of a history on that.
I haven't as of yet. I will be caveat all day. As of yet, I have not found tea as a business. I have found several references to midwifery and the use of teas, particularly their stories out of Alabama. And so I found like Alabama, Mississippi, Australia, where there is a market for those who are in the health field who use tea, but setting up tea shops, there was not wide support for that. I have found, I'm trying to think of the earliest reference to actual tea shops. I would say I've seen a couple in the 1920s, where they were often used as a shelter for prohibition. Come in for tea, and then in the back we have the good stuff. So there's a couple of good references where restaurateurs, or it was kind of I'm sure you've heard of the Green Book, where people, African Americans could only travel certain places, and so it was kind of in the work with either health or hotels or certain things like that. But as a freestanding tea shop, not so much.
Hi, thank you. This is very interesting. Relating to the holistic health, do you have an opinion on ashwagandha tea? Do you have an opinion on ashwagandha tea?
I do not.
Okay, thank you.
I do not, simply because I'm not sure what that is yet.
Oh, okay.
Right, and so for those of us who don't know.
My daughter was actually asking. It's kind of become a craze, and it's supposed to help with a lot of anxiety, depression, sort of the mental health aspect of the holistic
There are a lot of references to different types of tea. I have not found that as a reference in a Black woman's memoir, but I'm wary. After my kind of early assessment of sassafras and understanding the need to not make health claims, I will leave that to my colleagues who are coming up this afternoon, who can actually say, this is what this substance under these conditions do to the body. As we heard earlier, that if you heat this tea, the vitamin C impact goes away. So I'm not even pretending to delve into any of those and articulate my opinion, because I understand that as an academic, your words have weight. And so if I say, oh yes, this is absolute, no, I say, no, this is what Black women have written about in their experience. And then we really do need to get away from this, like, tea solves everything.
Right. But it's interesting that it hasn't come up so it's kind of consistent with how it's become sort of a craze. Yeah, it's a current craze.
Right. And I think because I'm looking primarily historically, that may not. There's a lot of things now that are being, like Naomi Osaka talks about, and she's a wonderful case, even though she hasn't written her particular narrative. There's a narrative in Time magazine about mental health and how she is fighting for Black Lives Matter, but also she says things like, I wish people would appreciate Asian people as much as you do our tea. Like, we need to actually see, see how we're putting these narratives out and how it's being marketed and how people are targeted and the fallout from that. So
Exactly.
Thank you so much for that question.
Sure, thank you.
Too short. First, I'm another UMass alum, so yay. And I miss the snow, crazy as it seems. So my question is, have you found any sort of significant variation that African American women, Black women in the United States have used, either historically or contemporary, teas that are in ways that are different than the white community, or in ways that are specifically linked to African origin? And I'm kind of curious about that.
I would say in terms of use, thank you very much for that question. In terms of use, I was not surprised to see that African American women have used tea for, again, because there was a system of rape and selling children. And so there was a deep investment in understanding how to control your fertility. I was surprised to find that same narrative in Australia. So we're talking, and so this also complicates the idea of Blackness, that there's no one, we're all Black. Black Aboriginals are very, very different in experience. But if we're talking about experience and pulling up to the international level, I did see Doreen Ketenyari has a narrative where she talks about the history of activism, of women's activism, Aboriginal women's activism, because they had to control their fertility because of the serial rapes that were happening, much like Indigenous women here, where there's a disappearance and no one's talking about it. So the difference in experience and the difference in use has to do with the difference of lived experience and the need to pass down the understanding of herbs, the understanding of how you can control what little patch of life you can control.
Hello, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. And there's just a sort of, I would like to share a small bit of American tea history that's been a favorite story of mine, from New Orleans. And there was a period of time, not good on dates, but it was in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, that a lot of the fortune tellers were outlawed. It wasn't illegal for them to tell fortunes or to read fortunes or to read the tea leaves. It was made illegal for them to charge for them. And so the tea rooms, they incorporated their skills with the tea rooms, and instead of buying a fortune telling session, they bought a cup of tea. And until a few years ago, and I haven't checked in the last few years, until a few years ago, the longest consistently family-owned tea room in the United States was in New Orleans. And it was one of these that was one of the original tea rooms that had the fortune tellers come in and where the cup of tea also included a fortune telling, so that there was a, that ability, that income wasn't completely shut off to that group of people. So I hope that might work in with your.
Thank you very much for mentioning that. Yes, there's just such a wide variety, and this came under spirituality, where we understand Darlene Love, who was a singer, mentioned going on tour with Dionne Warwick. And she was saying, well, Dionne Warwick is always into those, her voodoo teas, right? Where you're reading tea leaves. There are so many traditions that were mentioned about authors' grandparents' use of tea to, and there's so much interesting cultural overlap between the experience of African Americans and port cities like New Orleans, right? Like Savannah, in addition to the relationship to indigenous and Native American cultures and how they truly do overlap and impact each other. So thank you very much.
And I do believe that some of the tea shop owners were Black African Americans. I'm not certain about that, but I think there is still some data remaining that would be available.
There absolutely is. I know it's going to take me at least 5 years to write this book. At least, because every time I know the limitations, and I'm teaching research methodology this semester, so I'm always thinking, the relationship between data and methods, and not overstating your claims, offering your limitations, making sure that you're qualifying everything. And I know that by the very function of my data, looking at published Black women's narratives, it's only literally a sliver of the complete experience that's out there.
Hi, my name's Eric. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's great. And what I love about every time I come to the colloquium is that there's always these kind of connections. And I was thinking last year, Christine Fulch, an anthropologist at Duke, mentioned the importance of Yopon, and particularly, I think in context of enslaved Africans in South America, because it's a plant that grew there. And I don't think it's something you'd run into when you look for tea, per se, because I think it was kind of supposed to be a coffee replacement, if I understood. It was a year ago, so. But I was just a little curious if you heard of Yopon or Casina or Asi, I believe it was referred to.
I might have. I have this bulbous database of a whole bunch of teas that I haven't really kind of linked to their origin. That doesn't come to mind, but I would have to look that up. As I've got this wonderful data sheet of everything that I've encountered, I have not really kind of sat with it, but it doesn't. I don't think that comes to mind.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
I love the connections.
Thank you. But please see me after. I'd like to, those who have offered those names, I'd like to take those down so I can see if they're actually appear in my database, and if not, I can search for them. Thank you.
Hi, once again, thank you so much for such a great presentation. Art has been very integral, I think, to your presentation. Annie Lee. Oh, so sorry about that. You mentioned Annie Lee, Eartha Kitt, and among other opera singers as well. And I was wondering what you found so far, or maybe hope to find in further research about the value of tea in the creation and proliferation of Black American art.
Fantastic question, thank you. I began with Annie Lee, and I think there's another slide. Okay, I can't find it. There's another slide that Annie Lee has called The Tea Party. And I'm always looking, even though I'm looking at narratives, I do notice, and again, because I'm a visual learner, I do look for art and artistic representation from, again, Black women themselves. Not represented, because now there's a lot of AI-generated stuff, and so there's many representations of Black women, that don't generate from Black women. So I've noticed, I feel like if I can find it in the art of Annie Lee, then it exists. And so there is the My Cup Runneth Over, which was the cover of the yoga book, but there is actually a painting by Annie Lee talking about the Tea Party. As far as performing arts, again, looking deeply at someone like Marian Anderson or Jessie Norman as opera singers, because they traveled to Italy, to Germany, to Japan, and they wrote extensively about their experiences going to Japanese tea houses, formal performances, and the appreciation of the listening audience in Japan that's very different than audiences around the world. There's so much interaction that I'm finding. So I understand that I'm bringing Black women's voices to part of an ongoing conversation that does really extend how we understand and appreciate art and true exchange of art. Thank you.
Okay, last question.
Hello, Professor Evans. Thank you for an exceptional presentation. As you spoke, what came forward was the importance of oral history traditions and storytelling with knowing women's history, specifically Black women's history. And I'm curious what you see in community as like a need or the work that's currently being done to capture, to preserve, to protect Black elders' stories, or even young Black herbalists' work regarding tea.
There is so much good work being done. I actually, again, I learn in community. And so I reached out to my social networks and my social network groups and formed, there's an africanatea.net, and it's a network of academic researchers, artists, and tea professionals. Because again, I stay in my lane. I know kind of what limited information my historical perspective offers, but I'm very much interested in being in conversation with those tea professionals who have been in this business for decades. Brandy Shelton, who owns a tea shop in Atlanta called Just Add Honey, and Wayne Ashford in Savannah, Georgia, have owned brick and mortar tea shops for like 30 years. And so I'm beginning to amass a network of people to listen to. And many of those people are in academia, but most of them are not. And there are actual tea professionals, like those who are represented here. There are community healers, community leaders, community political activists, shops like Harriet's Apothecary that link the narrative, like Harriet Tubman, who was an herbalist and who lived into her 90s. Just like Rosa Parks lived to age 92, we're starting to see this connection of this generation's recognition that we are, again, self-care and communal care in continuity, that we're not actually starting something new. So those conversations are happening. I'm encouraging them to happen as much as I can around me, and so that I can, again, learn in community. But there's so much more work to be done to recognize what in the diaspora we represent, but also to be in spaces like this where we can exchange and listen and learn. Much more to be done. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one last question just because you are a distinguished speaker with us.
Dr. Adams.
Dr. Evans, you mentioned looking into Savannah and at the coastal area. Have you found any information about the Gullah traditions and tea?
Now, yes, ma'am, you know I have.
I know you have. Okay.
Yes, one of the first calls that I made to was, to the microphone, yes. Chef Sally Ann Robinson, who, if you've seen High on the Hog, the foods, the kind of the food study of African American traditions in South Carolina, Gullah Geechee traditions in South Carolina. I reached out to her personally, and she kind of turned me on to a list of Black women chefs in the South Carolina tradition. And there is absolutely, Gullah Geechee tradition. Tony Timpton Martin mentions the South Carolina as a hotbed, just like North Carolina, but South Carolina and the Gullah Geechee tradition, because of the direct connection to African cultures that were unbothered for quite some time, there is a very unique history on coastal South Carolina that is represented. And that's one of the stories that complicates sassafras, because Chef Sally Ann says that, no, we dug up the sassafras root. So I put these, kind of the FDA in conversation with lived experiences like that, but that's absolutely a central point of Central Coastal Town. So thank you.